That's a shame. I actually thought we were having a reasonably serious debate. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Order. I'll just say to the Honourable Lady, she needs to sit down. In fairness to the member in charge, he's given a lot of interventions, but I certainly don't need you standing up and waiting to catch somebody's eye. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, if this just descends into a shouting match, we lose the principle which is there to defend all of us, including all the members opposite. We're not claiming a principle to support these benches and not those benches. It's a principle that supports all of us. And if we fail in our... I will take that intervention, yes, of course.
Most grateful. The Leader of the Opposition has quite rightly just said that it affects everybody in this House. Would he accept that at this very moment in time there is a complication, which is that the Committee on Standards report, which is currently being conducted under the aegis of the Sir Ernest Ryder recommendations, does raise questions about whether or not it is possible at this juncture to have a fair trial and natural justice. That is currently under discussion. Within the House. And the same will apply in regard to the question of the Committee on Privileges, which has itself already been criticised. I was on the Joint Committee myself, and I can assure the Leader of the Opposition there are serious problems which arise in relation to the need to rectify those omissions in the procedural fairness.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and I've heard the case he puts on natural justice now a number of times, and of course he has every right to make that case. I disagree, but that's the point of the debates we have. But that debate about natural justice or due process doesn't need to hold up this process. Yeah. This motion can pass today, should pass today, and frankly everybody should support it passing today to uphold the principles. And I don't think that there is a discussion about natural justice, an interesting debate. We will take different views on this, but that doesn't need to hold up this process. I will give way and then I'll make some more progress.
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gent for giving way, and he's quite correct to prosecute the case on the basis of principle. But there is still in the order paper, even if the government is not going to move it now, an amendment which would indicate that not everybody in this House shares his view about the importance of these principles. So does he share my view that at the conclusion of this debate there should be a division so that we know where every single member of this House stands in relation to this principle? Because at a time like this, on an issue like this, there should be no hiding place for anyone.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and I agree, because we have a duty here today in relation to this motion and in relation to these principles. And if we fail in our duty, the public will not forgive and forget that we have done so, because this will be the Parliament that failed to stand up for honesty, integrity and telling the truth in politics, failed to stand up to a Prime Minister who seeks to turn our good faith against us, and failed to stand up for our great democracy. And it's not just the eyes of our country that are upon us. It will also be the judgment of future generations who will look back at what members of this great House did when our customs were tested, when its traditions were pushed to breaking point, when we were called up to stand up for honesty, integrity and for truth. I move the motion, Mr. Speaker.
The question is, as on the order paper, I now call the Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, part of this is about the Prime Minister. My habit over 46 years has not been to make a public or private comment about a party leader, whether mine or somebody else's. I don't propose to change that now. If I have something to say to a Prime Minister, I say it to them directly, as I did first with Harold Wilson and I've done with most other Prime Ministers since then. My preference would be to go with the amendment. If it's not going to be moved, I can't. I think this is not the right time for the House to make a decision. I think the words of the amendment are ones that I would support, and I'm sorry that the House won't be able to consider them. I may be in the minority in supporting that, but that's not a problem in this House. That's what a lot of people do. Second thing is I think the words in the third paragraph of the Prime Minister's statement on Tuesday spell out the situation, that he didn't think, in effect, it was a party or the rules had been broken. He now accepts that it's been judged by the police to be different. He's accepted that. I don't believe we should build a great big cake on top of that admission, acceptance. I think the House would be better to leave it like that. And it would be better also... No, I won't. Thank you. It would also be better, not challenging you, Mr. Speaker, if the House decided that the reference to Privileges Committee should be made when all the information is available from the Cabinet Office report and from the results of the police investigation. The last thing I want to say is that, without attacking the Honourable Member for Ilford, those who heard the Today programme this morning heard the repeated reference to the local government elections on the 5th of May. I believe that whatever the Leader of the Opposition says, some part of what's before the House today is straightforward attempts to get party political advantage. I intend to have no part of that.
I now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think on a day like this, we think of all of those that made so many sacrifices over the COVID pandemic, those that lost so many loved ones, and our thoughts and our prayers today are with each and every one of them. Mr. Speaker, there is one reason why it is so important that this motion is debated and passed today. Because at the very heart of the scandal, there is one thing that needs to be said, one thing that needs to be heard, and it's the very reason that we all need to act. And the reason is this, that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is a liar. I genuinely don't say that lightly, and I don't say it loosely. I honestly believe that it's right that we are slow to use that word. But I equally believe that it is right that we should never be slow to say it and to call it out when it is so obviously true. Because members across this House know it to be true, and the public have long known that to be true. And that is why it needs to be said today, and why we all need to act. Because, Mr. Speaker, every single day in this chamber, there are motions that come before this House which are complex and nuanced. And there are usually two sides to an argument and valid reasons from whichever position is proposed. But I think we can safely say that this definitively isn't one of these debates. The evidence of the motion speaks for itself. It's as clear as day. If there ever was an open and shut case, this is it. Mr. Speaker, last December, the Prime Minister came to this House and denied that there were any parties in 10 Downing Street during the long COVID lockdowns. Typically and tellingly, he hid behind his staff in saying it. He told us that he was given firm reassurance that no parties had happened, that no rules had been broken. Every member of this Parliament witnessed it. The public saw it with their own eyes. And shamefully, to this very day, it is still on the record of this House. But we know the truth. And the truth contains no ifs, no buts, and no maybes. Mr. Speaker, the House was misled. And so were the public. And we were all misled deliberately because the Prime Minister knew the truth. Not only were parties happening, not only was the law broken, the Prime Minister was at the very parties he denied had even happened. The truth is simple, and it's this. He lied to avoid getting caught. And once he got caught, he lied again. There is no other way to describe it. There is no other word for it. Now, Mr. Speaker, I can understand that this may be a terrible truth for the government benches to hear. But it's a truth that they need to hear. And it's a truth they need to live with. And I say to the Father of the House, who I've got the utmost respect for, this has got nothing to do with any elections. This is about the behaviour of a Prime Minister in office. And much more importantly, the uncomfortable truth that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is a liar is exactly why they finally need to act and remove him from office.
Hear, hear.
And other Prime Ministers, including all the predecessors as Conservative Prime Ministers, would have been long gone by now. Mr. Speaker, the benches opposite put the Prime Minister in power. They have the power to remove him, and the public expect them to act. Mr. Speaker, we have reached this point. A motion of contempt in a sitting Prime Minister is shocking, but unfortunately it is no surprise.
Will my right honourable friend give way?
I will happily give way.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He's made an important point about the members on the benches opposite being here to listen and to see this. And regardless of the number of flushed or drained faces opposite, what does he say to those who have previously called for the Prime Minister to resign, but now, as things have got worse, have changed their position and are not here today?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, and I will come on to that in a little bit more detail. But I'd say to everybody, the Tory MPs that are here and those that are not here for whatever reason, is to show some moral fibre, to show a backbone, to recognise what this Prime Minister is doing to the very fabric of our democracy. And today of all days, to do the right thing and support this motion that is in the name of the Leader of the Opposition, but so many other parties in this House as well. Mr. Speaker, we shouldn't forget that when the Tories put this Prime Minister into Downing Street nearly 3 years ago, the Tories knew. No, actually, it was the Conservatives that elected Boris Johnson as their leader. And the important fact, Mr. Speaker, is that the Tories knew exactly the kind of person that they were putting into the highest office in the land. They knew his track record. They knew his character. They knew who he was. They knew what he was. And they still chose him as their leader. Of everyone in this House, the members opposite know better than anyone else that a trail of scandal and law-breaking was always going to define his time in office. And in these 3 short years, unfortunately those who made those predictions haven't been disappointed. The sleaze and the scandal have been 10 a penny. From lying to the Queen, to illegally prorogate Parliament, to shut this Parliament...
We've got to be careful. I've asked for moderate language, more temperate language, and lying to the Queen and bringing the Queen into it. I'm not having. Ian Blackford, I want you to withdraw. I want you to just withdraw that one.
For in deference to yourself, Mr. Speaker, I will do so, but let's not forget the fact that the Prime Minister was found in the highest court in the land of illegally proroguing this Parliament. Stuffing the House of Lords.
As I said at the beginning, and I know the honourable member will want to stick to what I said, it is about the terms of what we are debating. We can't go beyond that. So I know he's very good, and he can stick to the script that I've explained that we do so. Ian Blackford.
I will happily take that guidance, Mr. Speaker, but of course we'll reflect on the Supreme Court's judgment. Stuffing the House of Lords with Tory party donors, VIP lanes for COVID contracts, and even dodgy donations to decorate Downing Street. This is who the Prime Minister is. It is who he has always been. As Prime Minister, he has done exactly what it says on the tin. But the real point is this, and with every day that passes, and every day he stays in power, it is who the entire Conservative Party has now become.
My honourable friend for giving way. He's making a very measured and powerful speech that will strike a chord with the electorate in my area of all political persuasions who have been writing to me calling for the Prime Minister's resignation. What they are not surprised at is the repeated behaviour of the Prime Minister, the lame excuses and the pattern repeating over and over again. What is surprising is that the honourable members opposite are keeping him in office. Why does my honourable friend think that is the case?
Well, I have to say, I hope that members opposite listen very carefully to what my honourable friend has said. Because the power to remove the Prime Minister rests with them. It rests with them. Because they can submit their letters to the 1922 committee. They can recognise the damage that this Prime Minister is causing to the fabric of our democracy and, yes, to the integrity and the honesty and the decency of this House. It is just, well, you know, here we go. Once again, the Conservatives want us to sit down and shut up. Yep. They don't wish to hear the voices of us that are here to represent our constituents, that, quite frankly, are appalled at the way that the Prime Minister has laughed at the people of these Isles with his behaviour over COVID. So, if members vote down this motion, not only are they endorsing all those scandals and all that sleaze, they are handing the Prime Minister a blank cheque to do it over again, and I would be surprised if the honourable gentleman opposite me would accept the scandals, the sleaze, the corruption, and is prepared to give the Prime Minister a blank cheque. Because I don't want to. If he wants to do that, he can rise and he can explain.
Mr. Speaker, of course he's right to be surprised, because of course I'm appalled, and that's why I was encouraging him to sit down, because if he would just let us speak, he might advance his own cause. Some of us actually are extremely disappointed, but I will just say while I've got the floor, he, I think, heard what I said on Tuesday. He's a brother in Christ. Does he not believe in redemption?
I believe, Mr. Speaker, in truth and justice. And I believe that when a Prime Minister has misled the House, that he should face the appropriate sanctions. Mr. Speaker, I know you understand that I couldn't...
My honourable argument, but the gentleman opposite talks about a contrite position. Does he not agree when the Conservative Party at prayer attacks the very foundations of the Church of England? We should be taking no lectures from them on being contrite or reconciled sinners.
I have to say, we've had the usual deflection from the Prime Minister over the course of the last few days. And to see the Archbishop of Canterbury being traduced the way that he was,
the established church,
by the Prime Minister, the established church of their nation, to be traduced in such a way, my goodness, how utterly shameful. One more time and then I'll make some progress.
I thank the honourable gentleman giving way. And on the issue of Christian forgiveness, I wonder if it's worth pointing out to the House that before you can have Christian forgiveness, you first must have confession and contrition, neither of which we've seen from the Prime Minister.
Well, of course, how we get confession from a Prime Minister that denies everything, I just don't know. Mr. Speaker, I know you understand that I couldn't let this motion pass without a special word for the spineless Scottish Tories. Because in fairness, the Scottish Tory leader is probably the only person in the Conservative Party who finds himself in a deeper hole than the Prime Minister. In fact, he's so far down that political hole that he obviously found it impossible to dig his way out and make it down to London to vote his boss out tonight. Yep. Now, I know and understand that plenty of people back home are looking forward to the Scottish Tories being given a straight red in the council elections in a few weeks. For most people,
that's democracy. Democracy, eh?
There we go again, and I hope the people in Scotland are watching this, because what we see are the Conservatives trying to shout down parliamentarians in this House. That's what's happening, Mr. Speaker. For most people, it is very understandable. It is very understandable. There's Scotland's answer from the Tories. Let's shout Scotland down, because that's what they're doing this afternoon. For most...
Can we just calm down? I do want to hear the honourable gentleman, and I know he wants to get back on track. He doesn't want to distract from the importance of the debate. Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, you know, for most people, It's very understandable that their main reaction to the flip-flopping Scottish Tory leader on his support for the Prime Minister is disbelief and justified anger. But I have to admit, when I reflect on the position of the Scottish Tory leader, my main reaction is something that I know he'll appreciate far, far less. I actually feel sorry for him, because he's by no means the first person to have his career ruined by the Prime Minister. That particular pile of people is a mountain high by this stage, because ultimately everybody, and I mean everybody, is eventually thrown under the Boris bus. As we saw yesterday, not even the Archbishop of Canterbury is safe. Clearly the days of the Church of England being the Conservative Party at prayer are long gone. The Prime Minister's party are obviously praying to another god these days, though no doubt even that won't guarantee their salvation. But in all seriousness, Mr. Speaker, that unjustified attack on the Archbishop gives another toxic insight into the thinking and methodology of the Prime Minister. Because his modus operandi is very simple, and it's this. When he finds himself under political pressure, find someone else to blame, anyone else, just as long as he never takes responsibility himself. Because nothing and nobody else matters. The only thing that does matter is that this Prime Minister will stop at nothing to save his own skin. That is why members opposite should not save him today. Think about it. He wouldn't even lift his finger to help them. So if they have any self-respect, they need to ask themselves, why should they even be contemplating walking through the lobbies for him? Mr. Speaker, let me end on this point. It might surprise members that as a party that is so unapologetically seeking out of this very institution and out of this Parliament, I actually do care how it acts, how it operates, and the values that it holds. And I care deeply for this reason, because today's motion isn't just about this Parliament or this place. We should all know by now that democracy and decency are under assault the world over. And Mr. Speaker, if we fail to defend these values in every single institution we are part of, these values will decay and decline. It was George Orwell who famously said that political chaos is connected with the decay of language. And I know that people are deeply fearful about just how real that prophecy has felt in the last few years. Because when language decays, so does the truth, and so does trust in our politics. A Prime Minister who can't be trusted with the truth marks the end of that very dangerous decline. So, if today is about anything, it has to be about finally ending that decline. That decline didn't start with this Prime Minister, but it needs to end with him. Because we should all be very clear to what the consequences are if this House fails to act today. If we don't act, if we don't stop, then this Parliament will be endorsing a new normal in this Parliament and across our politics. A new normal where no one is held responsible, where no one is held to account, and where no one ever resigns. And that is exactly why this motion matters, because it can and it will only ever become a new normal if we put up with it. It only becomes normal if those responsible aren't held to account and aren't made to answer for their actions. So I would generally ask members from across the House, but especially those members opposite, if they have any interest in maintaining some dignity and decency in public life, they should finally hold this Prime Minister to account for his actions and remove him from office. They should support this motion, and they should submit their letters of no confidence, and they should finally show this Prime Minister the door.
William Ragg.
Thank you for calling me so early in this debate to deliver my sermon at this juncture. But if I may, by means of parish notices on this day, wish Her Majesty a happy 6th birthday. It's my intention, and still would be my intention were it to be moved, to vote against the Government's amendment. I appreciate my right honourable friend the Chief Whip's efforts to find a way through. He is somebody we are lucky to have in his role. However, we were at risk of making a mistake. The original motion is perfectly acceptable and allows for much of the spirit of the amendment. For example, the publication of the Grey Report would be automatic upon the conclusion of the Metropolitan Police's work. There was no need to complicate matters. The Ukraine situation is of huge importance, but the invasion of a sovereign nation by a dictatorial aggressor should not be a reason why we should accept lower standards ourselves. I have told the Prime Minister to his face that I think he is doing a good job robustly supporting the Ukrainian government, and Her Majesty's government, along with our nation, can be proud of their role and generosity. Let us give credit where credit is due. However, much as though I may have tried, I cannot reconcile myself to the Prime Minister's continued leadership of our country and the Conservative Party. I say this by means of context, so that everyone, particularly my constituents and colleagues, can understand my position without hiding my views with ever more elaborate disguises. To those constituents who disagree with me, I appreciate their anger, just as I can the anger of colleagues. However, say what you mean and mean what you say. I submitted my letter of no confidence to our honourable friend, the member for Altrincham and Sale West, in December of last year. I did so for the following reason. It followed the leak of the Allegra Stratton mock press conference video. In that video, I believe she did nothing wrong. She nervously laughed and sought to make light of an embarrassing situation. To see her crying on her doorstep, feeling the full weight of responsibility and anger of a country, was deeply moving. And I felt immensely sorry for her. And I say this, I hope that she is well and that she will be able to continue her distinguished career. But what alarmed me most was later that evening, a press preview of the winter COVID Plan B measures brought forward to try to move matters on. Now, we debated those measures at length, but we can agree, perhaps not on their extent or their importance, but they nonetheless sought to compel or restrict what people in this country could do. I therefore thought to myself, if a government was prepared to bring such measures forward earlier in order to distract from its own embarrassment, that the Prime Minister was no longer fit to govern. I care deeply about my colleagues. I know that a number are struggling at the moment. We have been working in a toxic atmosphere. The Parliamentary Party bears the scars of misjudgments of leadership. There can be few colleagues on this side of the House, I would contend, who are truly enjoying being members of Parliament at the moment. It is utterly depressing to be asked to defend the indefensible. Each time, part of us withers. Now, I have questioned my place in this party in recent months, and perhaps that's symptomatic of a swathe of our voters in the country. But I tell them firmly, I'm not going anywhere. And I urge them to stick with us at the forthcoming elections. But for us to maintain their trust and confidence, we must be seen to do the right thing. It is our responsibility. It is the Conservative Parliamentary Party's responsibility. We must stop delegating and delaying our political judgment. We each only have our own limited and imperfect integrity. We can't keep spending it on others who we cannot be sure will not let us down. Now, I have great empathy for all of those who worked at Number 10 and in the Cabinet Office. They bore an immense burden and worked in the most intense pressure. They worked hard and they made sacrifices. And I also extend that same empathy to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, who knows more than most the personal challenges and personal battles that came from the pandemic. But the matter before us is one at the heart of this institution, of our Parliament. I love this place, believing it to be a place of high ideals and purpose. What is said here matters. Quite apart from the Facebook clips about roundabouts and drains in our constituencies, or indeed the confected anger to wind people up, it should be a place venerated by those of us given the singular honour of being sent here. Yeah. Now, of course, it can be a pantomime, a farce, turgidly boring, obscure, but it should always be reasonably honest. And it is for that, I hope not naive principle, that I cannot support the amendment, and I will vote for the main motion.
Come on, Mr. MacDonald, you've been here longer than most people. Chris Bryant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I warmly commend the honourable member for Hazel Grove on the speech that he did. I think he did it with great courage and honesty, and frankly with the integrity that I think a lot of us have seen him show in his chairmanship of the committee. And I think that this House knows that select committees and the chairing of select committees is not always easy, because quite often people come to select committee meetings with fixed views. They're not all that interested in the evidence that is presented to them. And they resolutely hold the same view afterwards that they held at the beginning of the meeting, even though everything has been proved to be quite the opposite of what they thought. But I know from those who sit on his committee that he listens to the evidence and he is a very good parliamentarian as chair of the committee. I thought it all got a bit religious earlier, and I felt I was back at theological college. Being the only person, I think, in the House who can actually pronounce absolution on anybody, I thought I was suddenly going to get a new job. But can I just start by saying I want to warmly also commend the work that the Chief Whip has done this week, because I think he has got us today into a much better place than the House would have been if he hadn't made the decisions that he, doubtless advised by others, has made today. I had not expected to speak in this debate. I'll be very straight with the House, if you see what I mean, which is that it is sometimes very difficult being chair of the Committee on Standards and Privileges, because you get asked to comment on literally every single member of the House at some point. Yeah. I am absolutely scrupulous in making sure that I never comment in public or in private on anything that might possibly come to either of the committees. I didn't think this matter would come to the Privileges Committee, which is why I commented on it. And consequently, I think it's quite right that I recused myself. I will not take part in the deliberations of the committee on this matter if the motion goes through in any shape or form. I think I could have done it fairly. I chaired the Standards Committee when we had the Prime Minister before us on a different matter, and we found that we disagreed with the Commission, and we found in the Prime Minister's favour. But I understand that the House needs to know absolutely for certain that the process will be fair. And so, in a strange way, that means I can actually say something today. Oh, all right.
Can I commend him for his speech and for his thorough sense of decency? But I just wonder, does he think the same principle should apply to other members of the Privileges Committee?
I will say something later about the Privileges Committee, but having recused myself, I don't think it's really for me to tell them what to do or how to behave. But the one thing I'm very keen on is I think that I passionately care about Parliament. I believe in Parliament. I believe in democracy. It's the only way that I can get change from my constituents is through the democratic process. And anything that undermines trust and confidence in Parliament damages my opportunity to do anything useful in my life at all. Which is why I always want to urge the House to be extremely careful in these matters of standards and privileges. each generation of MPs has a special responsibility to burnish, not tarnish, the reputation of this House, because we hand democracy on to a future generation, and if we've undermined it, it may not last. I just draw to the House's attention that in this Parliament, 2 MPs have been found guilty of serious offences in a court of law, and another 2 are awaiting trial. 4 MPs have been suspended for 1 day, a minister was suspended for 7 days, and 7 MPs have been required to apologise to the House for breaches of the Code of Conduct. 3 MPs have resigned their seats in the face of convictions. The independent expert panel has suspended a member for 6 weeks for sexual harassment, made another apologise for bullying staff, and found another guilty of such terrible sexual harassment that he resigned his seat before the sanction came to the House. That is without any consideration of the matter of whether an honourable member or right honourable member has lied to the House. And it is not yet 6 months since the Owen Paterson saga, which I don't think really covered the House in glory. And in a very short period of time, 2 of our colleagues have been murdered. And others are wearing stab vests. We have to take the reputation of the House extremely seriously. Yes. Yeah. We have to burnish it, not tarnish it. I've heard ministers argue quite rightly that there has to be due process. I would say to the House that this is the due process. Yeah. It always has been the due process. When there's been a claim that either a member of the public or a member of the House might have committed a contempt of Parliament by lying to the House or breaching the confidentiality around a select committee report or whatever, the standard process is that it's sent to the Committee of Privileges, or as it used to be, the Committee of Standards and Privileges, and before that, the Committee of Privileges. So this is the due process. And I have absolute confidence in the other members of the committee that they will do a good job. They will think very carefully about, as the Right Honourable Member for Stone said, making sure that there is a fair hearing. Because the Court of Public Opinion isn't very good at providing a fair hearing, I find. The House should do a great deal better than the Court of Public Opinion. We try to uphold the rule of law. It's one of the duties for all MPs. And so I think it's particularly important that we make sure that there is a fair process, and I'm sure that the other committee members will do so. I'm not sure where that was coming from. Yes, of course, yes, the member for Wickham.
He makes a very powerful and important contribution, of course, mostly in relation to members of Parliament, but he will know occasionally somebody feels it necessary to use parliamentary privilege to say within the House things which those outside might otherwise sue for defamation over. Can he just confirm that he will consider whether we ought to have a right to reply for the public, so that if we use privilege, they've got some chance to put their side of the story?
The honourable member makes a very good point, and we've had some discussions outside the chamber about this. The difficulty is, I'm not sure that that's a matter for the Committee of Standards and Privileges. I think it is a matter for the Committee on Procedure. And I think there is a very good argument for putting something in place so that there is a right of reply. I can't go further for reasons that he may be aware of.
I don't want to open this into that area of debate. I know exactly what's going on, and I think we can leave that part of it there. Chris Bryan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The second point I was going to make about fair process is that it's actually quite a high bar that the Committee on Privileges will have to consider. I mean, I think it is, as the Leader of the Opposition said earlier, not debated that the House was misled. I think even the Prime Minister effectively admits that the House was misled. It was said that that rules weren't broken, and it is self-evident that rules were broken. So the House was misled. It got a false impression. The question is whether that was intentional. And the committee will have to devise ways of investigating whether there was an intention. And in fact, when... Oh, well, I think I ought to give way over there first.
Gentleman for giving way, and he is making an excellent and poignant speech, but does he not find it strange and deeply worrying that we seem to be in the position that the Prime Minister seemed unable or incapable of following his own rules and his own laws, yet he is using the rules of this place and the processes of this place to frustrate the course of, as one member has said, natural justice.
Chris Brown.
Well, I would normally agree with her on these kind of things, and I sort of would have agreed with her last night, but I think we're getting to a better place now. I think, in a sense, sometimes the backbenchers persuade the front benches of a better course of action. I'm looking intently at the Chief Whip at the moment, the Government Chief Whip. I was just going to say, Mr. Speaker, but in one moment, as the clerk advised, in the case of whether Stephen Byers had misled the House on a single occasion in 2001, in order to find that Mr. Byers committed a contempt in the evidence session for the 14th of November 2001, the committee will need to satisfy itself not only that he misled the subcommittee, but that he did so knowingly or deliberately. As I say, that is quite a high bar, but it is for the committee to decide that. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman, then I will...
I'm very grateful
Sir
to
William
the
Cash.
gentleman. I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman, first of all, because what he's just said is what I was going to raise with him, because the actual requirement under the Ministerial Code does say that it is open to a minister to correct any inadvertent error at the earliest opportunity. Ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation to the Prime Minister. The question is knowingly, and I'm very grateful to him for making that point clear.
Well, I think he's agreeing with me, so I would agree.
Yeah, leave it at that.
And the only difference I would have with him is that he was talking about the Ministerial Code. The Ministerial Code is for the Prime Minister. Yeah. This House adjudicates on its rules, its code of conduct, and contempt of Parliament. So they're different matters. This is about upholding a simple principle around making sure that ministers speak honestly. I would say one other thing about the committee. It is very important that the 6 members of the committee are not pressurised by anybody. Yeah. Members may not be aware, but the Attorney General and the Solicitor General are able to attend those meetings, are able to take part in the deliberations, but not allowed to move amendments or vote. But it's very important that the committee is able to do its business without being lent on by anyone. Yeah. And then the final point I'd make, Mr. Speaker, is why I think all of this is important is because I care far more about what's happening in Ukraine and on the cost of living crisis than about this. Far more. I've got constituents who are in tears about their finances at the moment. They have absolutely no idea how they're going to pay their bills, how they're going to pay the rent, how they're going to find school uniforms and things like that. They are in tears. And all of us have seen the horror in Ukraine. I've been speaking for a very long time. I said in 2014 that if we didn't take Putin far more seriously, if we didn't impose far more stricter sanctions in 2014, he would end up coming for the rest of Ukraine. Yeah. So I care far more about those things than I do particularly about this motion today. But they're not alternatives. Exactly. I would argue it may be in coming months that the Prime Minister will have to come to this House and say, we're going to have to change our strategy on Russia. We may have to consider offensive weaponry. We may have to consider British troops being put in a place of danger. Similarly, the Prime Minister may have to come to this House and say, I have to ask the British people to make further sacrifices because the economy is in a very difficult place and the public finances are in a very difficult place. You need, at a moment of national and international crisis, a leader of completely and utterly unimpeachable moral authority. I don't think we have that at the moment. I don't think we have that by a long chalk. But that's why these two things are intimately connected and not separate. It's why I believe this must be referred to the Committee on Privileges.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I say I appreciate and respect the seriousness of tone that the Right Honourable Member, the Chair of the Privileges Committee, just brought to the debate. I respect the work that he does as Chair of the Committee, and I respect the work of the other members of the Committee too. And that seriousness of tone, I believe, is an important one that we should try and adhere to. It is inevitable that there will be a party political overlay to this, And it is inevitable that, with the proximity of important local elections, party political elements and electoral considerations will intrude, as they have today, and I'm sure as they will be, in the way that whatever is decided will be reported later. But at the end of the day, the debate that we're dealing with is about a very serious matter, and it therefore deserves a serious tone. The right honourable gentleman referred to his past calling, if I may put it that way, as influencing his approach, and I respect that too. Well, perhaps I can do the same. I'm very conscious. I'm very proud of the fact that I was a lawyer before I became a politician, and I'll be a lawyer after I finish being a politician. And therefore, I hope to approach decisions like this from the perspective of a lawyer. And that may cause me, perhaps I can make a little bit of progress before I give way, and that may cause me, perhaps, in the view of some, to be cautious. But I'd rather be accused of being cautious than be accused of acting upon inadequate evidence or without a full and proper process. So that's the preamble to what I'm about to say, and I'll give way, of course.
Is a problem not? And let's assume that the Prime Minister inadvertently misled the House, that from the beginning he was not straight with us, even if he knew he was at a birthday sing-song and with a birthday cake. Why did he delay it for such a long time to be straight with Parliament? And isn't the point that we are here today, so close to the local election, the delay that has been caused by he himself, not by us here on the opposition benches?
Robert Neal.
I don't think that actually reflects the tone of the debate that we've been taking so far. And with respect to the Honourable Lady, although I'll touch upon some of those matters, I'm not going to follow directly down that route. Because what we're talking about is an important and a serious matter. It's important because it relates not just to the incidents which are reported, and I think now, to some degree at any rate, accepted to have happened in number 10 Dowding Street, but it relates to a general culture and attitude, and it's important for this House because it relates to three important things, which I certainly hold dear and I hope all the House hold dear. One is the issue of public trust. The second is respect for the rule of law, and that in the context of adherence to the laws, and the fact that the laws made by this House must be adhered to by all equally. And can I just finish the phrase? I'm going to finish the phrase again. There's always a tendency to intervene while someone's partway through a sentence. And the third point that I wish to make is that respect for the rule of law also means respect for procedural fairness. And that's the point I'm going to come onto in a moment. Now, I know one of the honourable members opposite wanted to intervene. I'll do that first and then come to my honourable friend.
Mr. Speaker, I do thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I've just put on the record that he has been extremely courteous to me on a personal level ever since my first appearance here. I have great respect for the honourable member. I suspect that he, like I, and I speak as a Scot, is a unionist, and the benches in front of me know that. I believe in the United Kingdom. I believe in the benefits of the union between Scotland and England and Ireland and Northern Ireland and Wales. But part of the reason that union works is exactly what the honourable gentleman was talking about, is the respect for this place and the way we do things. So the point I make to the honourable gentleman is this: does he think that the continuation of the Prime Minister in office will strengthen or threaten that precious union?
Sir Robert.
As I will make apparent shortly, I will come to my conclusion as to the position of the Prime Minister, as I'm entitled to as a Conservative Member of Parliament, once I've had the full evidence. The importance of the respect of this institution in the various parts of the United Kingdom is, of course, well made, and I take that on board.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend.
Sir William.
And I would also like to commend his committee and his own role in this, in the investigation that took place with respect to the issue of fixed penalty notices. And just to note that the Council for Domestic Legislation, as he will remember, says that there was a great deal of lack of clarity as to what regulations apply to specific situations at what times, and so on, as I shall refer to if I can call a bit later. The bottom line is that I'm sure that the chairman of this committee is a very distinguished chairman of that committee, appreciates that in relation to the rule of law question he's just raised, it is by no means clear exactly what the law is on these subjects.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his observation. Perhaps that brings me on to the point I was going to make. The subject of the motion is, of course, not of itself the fixed penalty notice that was accepted by the Prime Minister or any of the other fixed penalty notices. It is, as is rightly said, the question of whether or not there was a deliberate misleading of the House. I think that's the common ground. Of course, the fixed penalty notices are part of the factual background that give rise to that, and he is quite right to say that the Justice Committee was critical of the fixed penalty regime that was brought in on a number of counts, and in particular the confusion that existed in many people's minds, ordinary individuals whose cases would never be the subject of any comment in this House or in the media, of the distinction or non-distinction sometimes between guidance and law. And we were critical of that, and we were critical also of the use of fixed penalty notices for what were specifically described, and I think it is worth putting on the record, as criminal offences. Because I did take the trouble to look again at the regulations. And the original 2000 regulations, which were then amended shortly before the incident in which we were concerned, specifically are set out in terms that a failure to comply with a restriction under the regulations creates an offence. And the word offence is specifically used in the regulation. So we should not minimise that. We should not therefore say this is a civil matter, this is equivalent to a parking ticket. It is not. That's a simple question of fact. The Ministry of Justice accepted that in the statement which it made at the time the regulations were brought in, and the Justice Committee, when carrying out that inquiry, heard that in evidence, indeed, from the noble Lord Wolfson of Tredegar, when he gave evidence to us, and also from Sir Jonathan Jones, QC, the former Treasury Solicitor. So that is, in fact, common ground. I'll equally accept, and I'm sure anyone else with experience in legal matters would, that within the range of fixed penalties, a fixed penalty notice of £50 is at the lowest end, pretty much at the lower end of the scale of the fixed penalty notices that were available. Again, something that the Select Committee raised as to whether or not sort of level of fixed penalty notices that were imposed were really appropriate to be dealt with by way of fixed penalty rather than fine. But that's by way of background. But that's all very well. So therefore, we're dealing with something which was an offence. Accepting the fixed penalty discharges and, if you like, deals with a criminal matter, but it doesn't change its nature. So we shouldn't try and minimise it. And I don't. And I will say, without having come to a final decision about the Prime Minister's position, that I'm profoundly disappointed in what happened at number 10 Downing Street. People were badly let down. My constituents feel badly let down. I feel personally badly let down by what happened. And there must be consequences that follow from that. Now, what the consequence is, I think anyone would accept in fairness, depends upon an ultimate assessment of the measure of culpability. And that's why I would prefer, both in making my own personal decision and ultimately in the House making a decision, to wait until we have the full evidence and information before us. And that's why, had the amendment been tabled in the government's name been made, I would happily have voted for it, because I do think that full evidence includes not just the conclusion of the police investigations and nuisance or otherwise of any other fixed penalty notices, but also the content of the Sugro report. Because, as anyone appreciate, the Sugro report is very likely to include material which gives background and context which goes beyond the strict requirements of what is factually the statement of facts, if you like, that go with a fixed penalty notice. So that's why it's important to have that. I've been very generous with my time. I don't many want to speak, but I will give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my honourable and learned friend for giving way. Does he therefore appreciate that what he's just said about the Sue Gray report explains why some of us, at least, have been asking time and time again for it to be published in full, unredacted, immediately?
Yes, and I agree with him in that respect. I think it was unfortunate, I say no more than that, that the way the investigation by the police has been handled, and I say no more than that, has led to a delay which may not have been needed in terms of prejudicing any ongoing investigations. So, as a matter of fact, I believe it should be published in full at the earliest possible opportunity. Now, I certainly agree with him on that point. Now, I'll give way to the Honourable Lady and then I'll move on to my next point.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much to the Honourable Member for giving way. And he's making a very sound legal argument, and I acknowledge where he's coming from. But would he agree with me that in politics, as in life, very often there comes a point in an issue where one needs one's closest friends, one's strongest allies, one's wisest counsel to put a hand on the shoulder and say, enough. What you're doing now is going too far. It's damaging yourself, in this case your party, and potentially the country. Stop. That is what is in the best interest. Would the Honourable Member agree with me?
Speech and an intervention, and I simply say this: I will speak for myself and the advice that I give to my friends, and that which I say to my constituents and to this chamber. As I made it clear, I would have preferred that we had the Sue Gray report as well as all other material before we took a decision on reference to the committee. But I would not stand in the way of this motion unamended, because matters of important public interest arise. I personally will withhold my final decision until I do have all of that material. And you will understand, Mr. Speaker, that a very obvious reason for that is, for example, that a course of conduct may very appropriately attract a different judgment and different consequences from an isolated incident, particularly if it were one that were immediately admitted to and no more occurred. So that context is going to be really important to me personally. I think ultimately will be important to this House, and actually will be important to the broader community and to the country as a whole. So that's my word of caution. That's why I would have supported the amendment, and I understand and appreciate the spirit in which the Treasury bench brought it forward. But I'm not going to stand in the way of this motion proceeding either, because there are important issues. I will then, in due course, make my final conclusion, and when I do that, I won't be backwards in coming forwards about it. But I do hope that I will manage to do so with a spirit of perhaps loyally, but also the way I've tried to do politics, of genuine calmness and based upon the facts and the evidence. Because that is what the country deserves at the end of the day, is an assessment based calmly upon the evidence and the facts applied to the relevant tests that this House or the other appropriate bodies apply. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by going back to the excellent speech by the Honourable Member for Rhondda. And in his concluding remarks, he talked about the economic crisis facing our country and our constituents. And he's right to put that in the context of the debate today, because I think it speaks about the need to have a government with a leader that can command respect. With inflation at 7%, its highest rate for 30 years and rising still, with families facing the deepest fall in their living standards since the 1950s, with the pain of those energy bills and those rising food prices, compounded by the government's unfair tax rises, we know that our constituents are facing real hardship. It's not just a cost of living crisis, it's a cost of living emergency. And at such a time, the country needs a government that's going to be focused on tackling that economic emergency. And crucially, it needs a government that it can trust, with, as the Honourable Member said, moral authority. And I don't believe this Prime Minister and this government has that. And I believe that the Prime Minister's behaviour has been profoundly damaging to that trust. Breaking the very laws he himself introduced, laws he was telling everyone else to follow, laws he rightly said were essential to save lives and protect our NHS, laws that forced countless families to make enormous sacrifices. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe it's time Conservative MPs listened to the British people, people who kept to the rules and made those sacrifices. For example, a small business owner in Bramall who said, whilst I had to sit and watch the business I'd built up for 35 years collapse because my customers and I obeyed the rules, the Prime Minister decided he would ignore them. My family and I will never forgive him and those that treated us like fools. The member for Cheadle would do well to reflect on her constituents' words when she continues to support this law-breaking Prime Minister. Or this message, the member for Eastbourne from a constituent of hers who attended his father's funeral just 4 days after the Prime Minister's birthday party. We sat apart. We didn't hug each other. We weren't allowed to have a wake to celebrate his life. I just came home and cried that he was gone. When the next election comes round, I will remember. And the member for Lewis, whose constituent said, my parents were unable to attend my uncle's funeral. This pain will remain with them. The conduct and subsequent untruths of the Prime Minister are disgraceful and only add insult to their hurt. And that's the key point, Mr. Speaker. It wasn't just the fact that the Prime Minister broke his own laws. It's that he thought he could get away with it by taking the British people for fools. He stood at that dispatch box and told this House and the country repeatedly that there was no party, that all guidance and rules were followed at all times in number 10. The fact he thought he could get away with such absurd claims, let's be honest, we all knew were false at the time, and which the police have now confirmed were false, speaks volumes. It says clearly that this Prime Minister takes the British people for granted. He thinks the rules that apply to the rest of us simply don't apply to him. As a constituent of the member for Wimbledon says, the Prime Minister seems a man without shame and devoted to one principle only, staying in number 10. He is disgrace to the office of Prime Minister and an insult to the millions of the electorate who played by the book. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Grateful to understand where that quote comes from, because I don't recognise it.
To the Honourable Gentleman, I'll make sure that he does. The fact that Conservative MPs have let the Prime Minister get away with all this until now speaks volumes about them. They could have kicked this Prime Minister out of Downing Street 10 months ago and begun to restore the public's trust and confidence in the government and in our democracy. Instead, Conservative MPs have so far...
Sorry, it's a point of order. Point of order, Mr. Hammond.
Misheard the Honourable Gentleman. He has just said that I wrote something. No, what did you... Sorry.
He said he said something. He says that mess up, Ed David. He said he didn't, so that's fine, isn't it?
Instead, Conservative MPs have so far ducked their responsibility, only eroding public trust and confidence even further. The member for Cheltenham, for example, once said that his red line for resignation from the government was if there was a scintilla of a suggestion of unlawful action. Well, the Prime Minister has been fined by the police, yet the member for Cheltenham is still drawing his government salary. By keeping the Prime Minister in his job, Conservative MPs have made themselves guilty by association. And if they vote no, if they vote to kick the can down the road again, if they vote to bend the rules, to let one of their own off the hook again, if they don't hold the Prime Minister to account for his law-breaking and lies by voting this Prime Minister out, Conservative MPs should know that their constituents will hold them to account at the ballot box. Perhaps the member for Winchester should listen to the vet in his constituency who says, if I broke the rules and lied about it, I would get struck off. So why hasn't the Prime Minister been struck off? Lifelong Conservative voters in Guildford are saying they can't vote for the Conservatives anymore. Mr. Speaker, they complain about elections. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, if they won't hold this Prime Minister to account, the electorate will have to hold this Prime Minister to account. And the constituent of the member for Wokingham tells me that his MP, and I...
We're mentioning a lot of members and members' constituents. I hope the members have been notified that we're going to be name-checked.
I'm sorry, I have not noticed.
So what I would say is, can we now, if you're not going, I suggest that we don't name any more unless the members are aware of it. And in fairness, I think it's only fair in future we do that.
I take your ruling, Mr. Speaker. I was quoting from their constituents. That was the point, so that their voices could be heard in this House.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, the last 24 hours have shown that the government is in total disarray.
Hear, hear. Conservative
MPs are clearly too ashamed to back the Prime Minister, but still too complicit to sack him. The people each of us represent know the truth. They know the Prime Minister deliberately misled them and deliberately misled this House. It is an insult to their constituents, especially bereaved families in their seats. And it will be another Conservative stain on our democracy. If Conservative members fail to sack this Prime Minister, they will leave the British people no choice. And when it comes to the council elections on the 5th of May, let alone the next general election, it will become the patriotic duty of every voter to send this Conservative government a message that enough is enough by voting against them. Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister has held this House and the whole country in contempt for far too long. Now it must be this House's turn to hold him in contempt.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Where's Ellen? You're all right.
The whole House can now see that this matter has moved far, far beyond law into matters of deep politics and fundamental values. And I think as we consider both the motion and the issue at hand, every last member of this House might remember some very, very old wisdom. That actually, if any of us says that we never fall short, that we never break a rule, that we never harm someone else, if anyone ever says that, then I'm afraid they deceive themselves and the truth is not within them. So I am very grateful that we live in a society with the possibility of redemption, the possibility of mercy, the possibility that when somebody fulsomely apologises in a spirit of humility going on for some hours, that there is a possibility of redemption. And that, of course, is not to excuse what has been done. That is not to defend it. That is not to condone it. It's not in any way to say that what went on was okay. It would be to accept that it was wrong and nevertheless to forgive. And forgiveness is difficult. No one should pretend otherwise. Now, well, I think she's going to enjoy the rest of my speech, but I will give way to her for a moment.
I thank him for giving way. When we talk about redemption and forgiveness, isn't it at the earliest point possible, rather than drawing things out like the Prime Minister has done? And I think this is his main problem. Had he come here and immediately at least expressed his doubt that maybe he was at something that he didn't consider to be a party, it would be better. But that he denied everything was the main problem that we find in this House so difficult to swallow.
I'm very grateful to her, and I think she will recognise the spirit and the inspiration of what I'm saying, as people did on Tuesday. But I don't wish to be drawn excessively into theology about the timing of one's repentance. But I do wish to move on, because I think the point that I want to make in this moment is that many of us in this House, I can see members in front of me, choose to live their lives under certain commands. To love even their enemies, to bless those who curse them, and yes, to forgive as they are forgiven, sometimes for some grave matters. So when I sat here and listened to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, say these words in the House of Commons, which I won't put back on the record, people know what he said, when I read them again in Hansard, I think this is an apology worthy of consideration, of forgiveness for what went on, because this has moved beyond law. As far as I know, no one else in this country is being investigated by the police for retrospective offences. It's gone, it's behind them, it's past. But in number 10 in Downing Street, they are being held to a higher standard. They are being held to a higher standard in ways that other members of the public are not. And I can hear members barracking. The point is that is right. What I demand is that when we set these I'm sorry, not merely draconian, but barbaric rules on other people. Everybody in the centre of power should have understood that they had to obey not merely the letter, but the spirit of the rules. And I'm sorry, there should have been no cake in number 10, no booze in number 10. Well, just one moment, no booze in number 10. These things should not have happened. I do not defend, or I do not condone in any way what went happened. And I'm spoiled for choice. I'll give way to the honourable lady.
Thank the member for giving way, and I am mesmerised by his psychic powers if he does not understand that all offences are retrospective unless he knows someone's going to commit an offence. But does Neil agree with me that to forgive, to err is human, to forgive is divine, to repeatedly transgress, as this report already shows us, is something else? And isn't it important that we have this inquiry now to understand whether that has happened and whether there has been a repeated offence against us? Because in the last year, half of the public have lost even what little trust they had in politicians. The longer this goes on, the more repetition there is, all of us are besmirched. Isn't it right, in that spirit of forgiveness and redemption, that we are all given the opportunity for salvation?
Not for the first time, Madam Deputy Speaker. The honourable lady tempts me to give her references, and I would encourage her on the point of repeated offences and forgiveness to look at Romans 7. But the point, she does also invite me to clarify what I said. Of course, all offences are retrospective. The point I'm making is that, the police are treating Downing Street staff especially harshly in a way that the rest of the public are not being treated. Well, if the gentleman wants to say it's not true, I'll take his intervention.
People up and down this country who've received fines way beyond the measure they're imposing in Downing Street. He's got to get his facts straight before he stands up and says they've been treated more harshly. That is simply not accurate.
Of course, people up and down the country have been fined and punished and all the rest of it, and he knows perfectly well that I've stood here and complained about those things far more than he has, or anybody over on that side. He knows that perfectly well. The point I'm making is that the police are going back some months to offences committed some time ago in a way that they're not for other people, and I think that is accurate, and I think my honourable friend the Minister was nodding along earlier, and indeed she nods again. So in order to move on, when I sat here and listened to these words, I was deeply moved. For all that I have said, if he broke the law or acquiesced in breaking the law, if he lied at the dispatch box, he must go, I still felt moved to forgive. But I want to be honest to the House and to my voters that spirit of earnest willingness to forgive lasted about 90 seconds of the 1922 committee, which was its usual, I'm sorry to say, orgy of adulation, a great festival of bombast, and I'm afraid I cannot bear these things. This level of transgression, this level of demand for forgiveness, requires more than an apology, drawing a line under it and moving on in the way that the Prime Minister sought to do overnight with his interviews. I'm afraid the Prime Minister and those who advise him, and I'm sorry to be saying this on the record like this, they need to understand that this is a permanent stone in his shoe. For those of us who want to forgive him, we've got to see permanent contrition and a permanent change of attitude, a permanent acknowledgement that people like my constituent, married for 50 years, didn't get to see his wife in a care home on the 50th wedding anniversary, didn't get to see her, I think, possibly just through a window for her 75th birthday. I've only been married 25 years, but I know what that means to me. What am I to say to that man who didn't see his wife before she died, after 50 years, 75th birthday? What am I to say? Well, I tell you what I could say to him. I could say, because I know who he is, you and I are Christian men, and forgiveness is hard. And I don't like forgiving him. My spirit is much more full of wrath and vengeance. I feel much more Ezekiel 7:3 about this, and I'd invite anybody to look it up. I don't want to forgive him. I do not want to forgive our Prime Minister. The trouble is I like him. And the trouble is I helped him get where he is. I'll come back to that in a moment. And the problem is I am under a command to forgive. So the point I'm making is, and actually I'll talk about what the Right Honourable Gentleman Skye and Lochaber said. When I and others went out of our way not only to make him Prime Minister, but to do our bit, one case, my case, systematically to help get an 80-seat majority, we did not think that he was going to exhibit a meticulous grasp of tedious and boring, minute rules. Of course we didn't. But we did know he had two jobs. He had to get us out of the European Union, which he was fully committed to doing, and he had to defeat the radical leaders of the Labour Party, and he had to do it in an environment where everyone was exhausted, we were testing our constitution to destruction, and the very internal stability of the United Kingdom was at stake. And that's the job we gave him to do, and by goodness, he did do it. And for that I am thankful, and for that he will live with my thanks forever, and he will deserve to be lauded in the history books. But the problem I have now got, having watched what I would say is contrition, beautiful, marvellous contrition, isn't my sense of it, is it rather in a sense only lasted as long as it took to get out of the headmaster's study. And that's not good enough for me, and it's not good enough for my voters. I'm sorry, it's not. And I'm afraid I'm now in a position where I have to acknowledge that if the Prime Minister occupied any other office of senior responsibility, if he was a Secretary of State, if he was a Minister of State, a Parliamentary Undersecretary, a Permanent Secretary, a Director General, if he was a Chief Executive of a private company or a Board Director, he would be long gone. The reason that he is not long gone is because removing a sitting Prime Minister is an extremely grave matter, and goodness knows people will know I've had something to do with that too. It's an extremely grave matter, an extremely big decision, and it tends to untether history. And all of us should approach such things with reverence and awe and an awareness of the difficulty of doing it and the potential consequences. And that's why I've been tempted to forgive. But I have to say now, the possibility of that really, for me, has gone. I have to say, I'm sorry, that for not obeying the letter and the spirit, and I think we have heard that the Prime Minister did know what the letter was, the Prime Minister now should be long gone. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll certainly vote for this motion, but really, the Prime Minister should just know the gig's up.
The House will be aware that a great many people wish to speak this afternoon, and if we are to continue the spirit of fairness one to the other, I hope that we'll manage without a time limit. So I'm testing the integrity of honourable members. Please stick to around 5 minutes, and that way everybody will have the chance to participate more or less equally. If it doesn't work, I'll put on a time limit as usual. Where's Carl Turner gone? There you are. Carl Turner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I intend to be less than 5 minutes. But I think this is probably the most unusual debate that I've had the privilege, frankly, to speak in since the time that I was elected to this House in 2010. It's unusual, Madam Deputy Speaker, because unlike on Tuesday of this week, when I suggested that the electorate had already concluded that the Prime Minister was either a liar or an idiot, I was called to order by the Speaker, and perhaps the Speaker was right. But look, the truth is, we have good reason to suggest that we've been misled by the Prime Minister. Why? He repeatedly said that no rules were broken. He repeatedly said that no parties had taken place. He then suggested that he didn't understand the rules that had been written by him, by his government. He couldn't get his head around those terribly complex rules. And then I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, contemptuously, he or Downing Street, the spin men and women from Downing Street, suggested that this was just a bit like a speeding offence. And I think the Honourable Member for Bromley and Chislehurst made this point. Of course, it's nothing like a speeding offence. These are criminal sanctions. And in fact, if you want to talk about speeding offences, there's something called the totting up procedures. So if you get one speeding offence, it's 3 penalty points. If you manage to end up with 4 offences in a 3-year period, you're banned, disqualified from driving for a period of a minimum of 12 months. And if you're a newly qualified driver, if you're somebody who don't really understand the news, the rules because you're new into the thing, and you get 2 speeding penalties, you are banned from driving, disqualified from driving. In fact, you have your driving licence revoked. I'd rehearsed a speech that I was intending
to make today. But I've binned it, Madam Deputy Speaker, because whilst I was here waiting to be called, a constituent contacted me, Wendy Phillips, and she says this: I'm watching the debate. Your constituent, Lily Cam, Tory voter for over 50 years, fell ill with COVID exactly 2 years ago. 4 weeks later, she died in a care home whilst the Prime Minister parted. The family feels so guilty. She was only in a care home for her own safety for 5 months. We let her down. I'm watching this in tears. I let her down. I was her voice. I persuaded her to enter this care home for her own good. I carry that guilt daily. So I pray, Nate, to members opposite, think carefully today. Think very carefully about what the decision they take on behalf of their constituents is. Look in the mirror and look back, see what's looking back. Is it someone who is honourable? Someone who is not prepared to put up with a Prime Minister misleading the country? If they don't, I'm afraid to tell them that the electorate, who have already decided, will make their anger known at the next election. Thank you.
Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to put on the record that many of my constituents are angry, upset and hurt by the activities in Downing Street. I have heard many harrowing tales of the sacrifices my constituents have made. But I want to address one point. The Leader of the Opposition refused to take my intervention, and I want to address what I was going to say. The Leader of the Opposition implied that he wanted to rise above party politics, and indeed, that is a noble sentiment. However, I dispute that that was what was happening for 2 reasons. Firstly, I understand that a Labour Party spokesman last night was briefing that Conservative MPs who did not vote for this option would, quote, pay a price, that individual campaigns would be launched against them in their constituencies. That is threatening, bullying, toxic talk. And I sincerely hope that that does not happen. The second reason that I think this is not entirely about party politics is that the gentleman opposite, the member for Ilford North, my apologies, trailed the studios today, talking about local elections and about superior leadership shown by the Leader of the Opposition. I'd like to remind this House that the Leader of the Opposition twice campaigned for the member for Islington North to be put into the highest office in the land, a man who was later censured by the EHCR for anti-Semitism. And think what would have happened had he been the leader with the situation in Ukraine. Let me tell you, that is leadership that I can do without.
Caroline Lucas.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We often see the worst of Parliament, certainly in recent weeks and months, but I think particularly with the speeches by the Right Honourable Members for the Rhondda and indeed for Hazel Grove, we are also seeing at least some of the best of Parliament this morning as well. I want to be clear about what's at stake in today's debate, because this isn't just about parties or about cake or about a fixed penalty notice akin to a parking ticket. What is up for debate today are our most profound democratic principles and the very concept of decency in public life. Leading by example versus hypocrisy, truth versus lies, and respect versus contempt. And that is so because the Prime Minister has sealed his place in history as the first lawbreaker to have been fined while occupying our premiership, proving beyond doubt that he misled this House when he told us repeatedly that no rules were broken. Well, we now know that they were broken, and broken by him. Our democracy depends on the truth being told by ministers. That is why resignation is what is expected when this basic and fundamental standard is not met. So this isn't about cake in a box or the number of minutes spent at a gathering. This is about a Prime Minister failing to hold himself to the highest standards at a time of unprecedented national sacrifice and then covering it up. This is about a Prime Minister holding both Parliament and the public in contempt. A Prime Minister trashing decency in public life and undermining the foundations of our democracy. And so when last night the Prime Minister tried to brush off the importance of today's debate by saying, and I quote, "You're better off talking and focusing on the things that matter," he couldn't have been more misguided. Being able to trust our ministers, and above all, the Prime Minister, matters in this place more than anything, because without it, the whole edifice collapses. Parliament has many roles, but its most important one is surely the role we play in providing a check on executive power through our ability to scrutinise the actions of government ministers. Without that, they would be free to exercise their powers as arbitrarily as they pleased. Yet our ability to play that role is totally undermined if we can't trust what ministers tell us, if we can't rely on the accuracy of the information that ministers are giving to Parliament. If ministers can get away with misleading answers, what is the point of asking the questions? If you hollow out the scrutiny process because the answers could be lies, you hollow out this whole place. So if MPs don't launch an investigation when the Prime Minister has been found to have personally broken a law which he repeatedly told this House had not been broken, it is not just the Prime Minister's credibility that's damaged. It's the credibility of Parliament itself, and indeed the credibility on which our entire system of democratic governance is built. Madam Deputy Speaker, this whole sorry episode has demonstrated that Parliament's governance structures, our systems of checks and balances, is in urgent need of reform. It cannot be right that if the Prime Minister makes a misleading statement and commits a contempt against Parliament, it's up to the Prime Minister themselves to determine any consequences. It is beyond ludicrous that the arbiter of whether or not the ministerial code has been broken is the person who's accused of breaking it, the Prime Minister. It is preposterous that if MPs wanted to a recall of Parliament to happen to discuss a matter such as this, it is only the Prime Minister who can initiate it. As MPs, we are unable to require ministers to correct the record if they mislead the House. We can't compel an investigation into such actions or impose sanctions. Madam Deputy Speaker, old boys' club rules that simply assume honour are manifestly not adequate. And as a result, a rogue Prime Minister is running rings around us. So surely this is a moment when we must review those archaic procedures that have been so clearly demonstrated to be unfit for purpose. We need independent oversight of the ministerial code. We need new mechanisms to be able to call to account a Prime Minister who deliberately misleads the House, a Prime Minister who, in the words of the respected constitutional historian, the Lord Hennessy of Nymphsfield, has shredded the ministerial code, a crucial part of which, he says, is the spinal cord of the Constitution. That code includes an overarching duty on ministers to comply with the law, and if you've broken your overarching duty, it's clear you have an overarching responsibility to go. But our system is broken, and the glaring flaws in how the ministerial code functions have been recently investigated by the Committee on Standards in Public Life, chaired by the Lord Evans of Weardale. That committee reported on the importance of high ethical standards just 1 month before we found out about the rule breaking in number 10. The chair made it clear that our standards regulation, which relies simply on convention, is no longer satisfactory. It is quietly damning and on point. The House must urgently act on the committee's key recommendations that, and I quote, ethics regulators and the codes they enforce should have a basis in primary legislation and that government has a more thorough and rigorous compliance functions. In other words, we can no longer leave this in the Prime Minister's hands. On the Ministerial Code in particular, the committee found that meaningful independence for the independent advisor is the benchmark for any effective standards regulation, and that the current arrangements for the advisor still fall below that bar. Now, that must urgently change if we are to restore any respect for this place. In particular, we urgently need to implement the call for the independent advisor on the code to be appointed by an independent panel rather than by the Prime Minister. And it is vital that they should be able to initiate their own investigations and have the authority to determine breaches of that code. We must also grapple with who should decide and issue sanctions in the event of a breach by the Prime Minister themselves. The vested interest of a rule breaker deciding their own sanction cannot be discounted any longer. In my final words, Madam Deputy Speaker, I just want to say a few words about the situation with the war on Ukraine. It is the centrality of truthfulness to our democracy that makes it such a serious misjudgment to seek to put our democratic standards on hold because of the brutal war on Ukraine, as some honourable members have suggested. Attempts to corrode democracy and promote the politics of division is exactly what runs through Putin's war strategy, which means that it is now more urgent than ever that we have a Prime Minister here with unquestionable moral authority. The resignation letter of the Lord Wolfson of Tredegar, who resigned from the government as a Justice Minister, had it exactly right. The government can, and I quote, only credibly defend democratic norms abroad, especially at a time of war in Europe, if we are and are seen to be resolutely committed both to the observance of the law and also to the rule of law here. Putting decency on pause, bending our rules, plays into Putin's hand because his brutal war on Ukraine is not just a battle for territory, it is about democracy and is about the rule of law. It is also the case that we have a long tradition, as many other members have said, of removing war leaders, and the ability to change a leader during a crisis is a strength of our system. I will.
Just before the Honourable Lady gives way, I did ask for 5 minutes and the Honourable Lady has taken 9. She might wish to consider whether she's giving way or whether she might be concluding soon.
Speaker, on that note, I will not give way. I had not realised it was 9 minutes. I will bring my comments to a close, but simply to say again that this matter could not be more important, and that's why it matters so much that the resolution is passed later today.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you very much indeed. Open by acknowledging what I thought was a fair, measured spirit in which the Leader of the Opposition opened this debate. I thought he spoke in a fair-minded way, as have many other members and right honourable members on all sides, including those friends of mine who have sadly decided that they can no longer support the Prime Minister. But I want to speak in his defence today, because somebody has to. And I acknowledge, in all seriousness, how big a mistake he made. Of course, he should apologise for it and take responsibility and accept the verdict of the police, whether he was surprised by that verdict or not. And if he lied to this House, of course he should resign. But he didn't. Patently, he didn't. Patently, he didn't break the law deliberately. And so patently, he didn't deliberately mislead this House. Any more than the Leader of the Opposition deliberately misled the House when he said that the PM had slandered the BBC. And I welcome his sort of apology that he made earlier. And we can now all move on from that mistake and remember that only those who are without sin should be casting stones. So I do not minimise the importance of this scandal. Many, many people are outraged by what has gone on and have written to me to that effect. Many are just the usual haters who always despised the Prime Minister, but many are the respectable tendency of our country, often Conservative voters, who just want a steady, decent, respectable government. And I think particularly of my councillors in Devizes and party members who have written to me in despair at what the Prime Minister has done. And they are right to want a steady, decent, responsible government. We don't have to have a soap opera in Downing Street. But we do need a government and a Prime Minister who can see the big picture and make the big calls. One who doesn't always play for safety. One who doesn't always do the conventional thing that the officials suggest. One who doesn't always think, what would John Major do? So let me finish with a word about the character of the Prime Minister, who I've known a little for many years, and who I had the privilege of working closely with in Downing Street in those crazy months in the second half of 2019, when he and my other old friend, Dominic Cummings, drove through the strategy that finally got Brexit done. There was a lot of smoke and noise in those months, but in the midst of it all, I saw the Prime Minister in relentless pursuit of the mission. Total flexibility about the methods to be used, including a proportionate response to the tactics taken by the other side in their attempt to subvert the democratic process. The European Union saw how serious he was at that time, and it is because of that that they finally accepted a deal that we could also accept. And the country saw it, and they responded with a landslide election victory for our party. And I don't believe any other leader would have done it. Now, none of this would justify lying to this House, but I don't believe he did lie. And those are the reasons why I follow him, in spite of everything. In spite of his accepting a slice of birthday cake when he shouldn't have. In spite of overseeing a number 10 operation that let the country down. In spite of some policies that I am unhappy with. I support him because he was anointed by the people in 2019 to deliver a great mission, to unite and level up the country, and because he can make the big calls that are needed at this time. Thank you.
Yes, I can anoint people.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable member from Devizes. Well, may I just politely and respectfully point out the difference between the approach of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. When the Leader of the Opposition erred, he came straight to that dispatch box and amended the record, and that's what we're asking the Prime Minister to do. There's a huge distinction between the two cases. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are at a crisis point for our democracy. The Nolan Principles provide clear guidance as to conduct in public office, but they're being more honoured in the breach than the observance. We know that when the Prime Minister stood at the dispatch box and told this House that there had been no parties and that all guidance was followed at all times, that neither of those statements were true. They were palpably untrue, and this matters. It's beyond the realms of credibility that the Prime Minister could possibly have thought that either of those things were truthful when he said them. He's gone through his life with the rules not applying to him. But the public have made their mind up. In opinion poll after opinion poll, the public have said very clearly that the Prime Minister of our country has lied. And this sorry issue has to be resolved.
Would he take an intervention?
I will indeed.
Would he agree with me that this boils down to trust, and the motion really refers to trust within this House, trusting a committee which reflects the proportional balance of this House to deal with the matter in a proportionate way once all the evidence is in?
I wholeheartedly agree with my honourable friend. It all comes down to trust in this place, and as other members have pointed out, it's that trust that we need if leaders are going to make important decisions about the cost of living crisis and our interventions that may be demanded of us in Ukraine as we go forward. That's why trust matters. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's bad enough that a serving Prime Minister has broken the law. But the public are certain that he lied when he denied that he hadn't broken the law, and his lame defences as to what he believed are now in tatters. It's therefore imperative that the appropriate mechanisms of this House are engaged, as so expertly described by colleagues and as on the ordered paper, and that this behaviour be referred to the Committee of Privileges to see whether the Prime Minister is in contempt of this place and indeed in contempt of the country. I will, yeah.
Just going back to his point about this sorry issue must be resolved. He knows I had the privilege of serving as the Cancer Minister in this House. Right now, this House should be discussing childhood cancers. Now, if one was a parent of a child with cancer, I suggest they would rather the House were discussing that than this. That is not to minimise this. That is that this issue needs to be resolved and we need to move on. And for that reason, I will be supporting the main motion with him, I suspect, this evening.
Well, I'm grateful for the honourable member who speaks so wisely. But he's right. We all want to move on from this, but we will find, unless this issue is resolved, we'll be back to it forever until such times as the Prime Minister accepts the consequences of his actions. We need that leadership, and we're robbed of it at the moment. That's the entire point. Of course, cancer with children is critically more important. We want to get onto that, but we cannot have this issue hanging over us. Madam Deputy Speaker, sadly, this wanton disregard for the principles of public office are part of a wider malaise, and we see it in many of our public offices. And I won't stray, Madam Deputy Speaker, to recite them. But I do plead with members opposite to actively vote for this motion. I'm pleased that the government benches have made the movement that they have thus far today. But we've heard so eloquently described that the people need to have trust in this place. Democracy is at stake. It's therefore imperative that people come forward and actively support this motion. I'll finish with this, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't know whether you heard, but on LBC there was a heartbreaking interview of a veteran. This man could not contain his emotions as he spoke not only of his own service, but also the loss of his son serving this country in Afghanistan. And his anger at the lying of the Prime Minister overwhelmed him. He wrongly criticised himself for sacrificing so much for his country and felt it had all been for nothing. People in this place, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've heard from the excellent speeches from the members from Hazel Grove and my friend from the Rhondda, and indeed Wickham, who have spoken so courageously. They care deeply about this nation and its democracy. We all do, and for that reason we should stand up for its integrity and reputation, which I regret to say is being trashed on a daily basis by this disreputable Prime Minister. And I urge members across the House to vote for this motion today.
Yeah. Sir William Cash.
Entire issue and the legal status of fixed penalty notices and what the law really is, as I indicated in the House in my response to the Prime Minister's statement on Tuesday, remains on the table. It is unfortunately and regrettably a matter of extreme complexity and is charged with political and understandable emotional underpinning. For example, the Justice Committee have themselves had a great deal of importance to say in seeking clarification of these matters of law and the rule of law itself in this context. The legal situation even now remains immensely unclear and inconsistent, despite the presumptions that one opposition speaker after another makes that the Prime Minister has lied. This is the case in respect of this lack of clarity and inconsistency, as between different police authorities and different circumstances and different locations. The Council of Domestic Legislation to this House indicated in evidence to the Justice Committee as follows. He said, there has been a lack of clarity as to what regulations apply to specific situations and at what times. There is evidence that local authorities and police forces have sometimes misunderstood the circumstances and so forth. It is even very arguable that under Section 73 of the Public Health Act 1984, the regulations did not apply to number 10 anyway as part of the Crown Estate. Resolving that issue will be a massive test even before a court of law. On the question of contempt and the role of the committee itself and the current procedures where privileges or contempts are referred to that committee, the great constitutional authority, Bradley and Ewing, on that subject states that the committee's procedures have been criticised in the Nichols report of 1999, and as I've said in previous debates in relation to the Committee on Standards, and again today, all this is currently under review. It is currently under review here in this House with Sir Ernest Ryder's important report relating to the principles of natural justice and fair trials before that committee. And indeed, they will need some very, very good legal advice. In 1999, it was concluded that the Committee on Standards should devise an appropriate procedure to ensure natural justice and fairness, as I exchanged in my comments with the current Chairman of the Committee on Standards. All this is being currently conducted under Sir Ernest Ryder's report. How the Committee of Privileges is easily going to cope with the situation is one thing, but what is crystal clear is that not to wait until the Sue Gray report has been delivered, as well as the conclusions of the Metropolitan Police investigations, will only lead to further confusion and the need for the committee even to have to suspend its proceedings even before they've begun. The question remains, has there been a contempt, and what is the proper procedure that should be applied, and is it fair as a matter of natural justice in the way in which the procedures are currently being proposed? That depends on the evidence, it depends on the facts, it depends on an understanding of the law. And the committee is going to have to address all this before it could even sit and make any conclusions with any degree of competence.
Liz Savile-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn,
Please, it's confused me. Liz Savile-Roberts.
I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful that you found me. And just before I start on my main points, there's a couple of things that I've been listening to. And the first that has struck me is that the government, I think for many of us on this side, were really aware of the fact that the government were trying to kick this issue down the road with their abandoned amendment. And it now just begs the question, really, that we're 2 weeks away from the local elections. Were they more desperate to make sure that the names of their MPs were not on the record in the way that they voted, and that was their motivator? And the other thing that strikes me with the government's approach is they live in hope that the public's memory is ruled, that the public's memory be ruled by the news cycle, and that they live in hope that the public interest will move on. I believe the government is fundamentally wrong in this assumption. Everybody who made a personal sacrifice during COVID will remember their loss or their pain or their grief for the rest of their lives. It is engraven on our hearts. We are not going to forget. The government may kick this down the road, but I'm afraid that they are wrong if they assume that they are tied up and that their safety is tied up with the news cycle. The Prime Minister's behaviour will not be forgotten. But today we have a chance to correct the record, to reinstate credibility in our system and hold members opposite, and indeed all of us, to account, not for their or our misdeeds only, but for our preparedness on occasion to defend the indefensible. Today is a chance, therefore, for all members across all benches to do the right thing, and I think our names should be on record when we want to do the right thing. Public trust in our democratic system is plummeting as we careen from one scandal to another. The very reputation of our democracy and of ourselves and the function that we have here, that we're honoured with, seemingly at stake. Madam Deputy Speaker, 73% of the British public are in favour of a bill that would criminalise politicians who would willingly lie to the British public. And that's something that Plaid Cymru has been calling for stronger measures, those which would ban politicians from lying in their public role, not just over the last few months. We've been calling it for the last 15 years. We all know that we live in an age of public disenchantment. From that same poll conducted by Compassion in Politics, we learnt that 47% of people have lost trust in UK politicians over the last 12 months. And if we look back over the momentous events over that period, from the fall of Kabul to the pandemic, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the cost of living crisis, what other conclusion can we draw than that we have failed in our duty to seek to uphold the trust of the public? Yeah. This sense of failure isn't just a rhetorical gambit, a professional nicety, an optional extra for us here. From anti-vaxxers to the Putin regime, when we fail to confront mistruths, we create a truth vacuum in which division sets hold. When any truth is as good as any other, division along political lines comes to matter more than agreement on the common ground of facts. This matters. This matters. We work in an institution where we can't call out the lies of another member, regardless of their position and responsibility. Lies which are broadcast around the country, recorded for posterity, and those lies are therefore impressed on the memories of millions of people. And we have no way of addressing this effectively. When I defer to the judgment of the Speaker on this matter, Partygate has demonstrated conclusively that our self-regulating system is really to question, is it fit for purpose? The ministerial code has proven not worthy of the paper on which it was written. Gentlemen's honourable agreements are dependent on honour, on the existence of honour, and we must do better. And if we can't do better because we make a mockery of the public concerns by shrugging our shoulders and accepting that it's merely part and parcel of modern politics, then we must be compelled to do better. We, as legislators, must legislate to uphold our good names, and by extension, not just our good names, but the good name of democracy itself, the very efficacy of democracy itself. And the first step would be, and I close here, the first step for this would be a bill. A second would be to rebuild our political model, much as Wales and our cooperation agreement has done so that politics is built around what we share rather than that which divides us. Honesty is the most important currency in politics, and we have to restore it before we here are responsible in part for bankrupting our society.
Alexander Stafford.
Speaker. Much has already been said here today about the police's investigation, as a result of which the Prime Minister was issued with a civil penalty, paid it immediately, and then came to this House at the earliest opportunity to give a heartfelt apology. Not only that, but it's clear he and the government are not opposing this moving to the Privilege Committee, which clearly shows that his contrition is right and true. Let me be clear, his apology was the right thing to do. Each and every single Briton across the length and breadth of our beautiful country has made sacrifices during this pandemic. For myself, when my first daughter was born, my wife was very seriously ill after that. I could not see my daughter for 5 days after she was born. Because of it, I made the sacrifices. All my residents made the sacrifices. Even the Prime Minister has made the sacrifices when he almost died from COVID. When his own family members died, he couldn't attend the funerals, as we know. Now, I believe all politicians should be held to the highest standards, be that the Prime Minister, or the Leader of the Opposition, or the Right Honourable Member for Islington North, or the Scottish First Minister, all of whom have been caught, photographed in COVID-compromising positions, all of whom I believe should be referred to the Committee of Privilege to be investigated. The Prime Minister has paid the fine, and rightly so. He has been unequivocal that he respects the outcome of the police's investigation and will always take appropriate steps. But the central issue, which I believe here today, is where the Prime Minister intentionally misled the House, and it is the word intentionally or knowingly that is vital. Now, I point to an article published in the Times newspaper on Saturday the 20th of June 2020, the day after the event in Downing Street in question. The article reads, and I quote, "Boris Johnson celebrated his 56th birthday yesterday with a small gathering in the Cabinet Room. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and a group of aides sang him happy birthday before they tucked into a Union Jack cake. The celebrations proved a brief respite after another gruelling week," and so on and so forth. The Prime Minister had said that it did not occur to him, then or subsequently, that a gathering in the Cabinet Room just before a vital meeting on COVID strategy to save lives could amount to a breach of the rules. This event at Number 10, as I mentioned, was reported the next day in a national newspaper and did not then prove controversial. It is unfathomable that the Prime Minister's team would have alerted journalists to the event and incriminated him if he knowingly believed it was against the rule. It does not make sense. But nevertheless, the Prime Minister has apologised and has been punished. And further, in evident transparency, he is welcoming to be moved to the Privilege Committee. I also want to talk on this notion, briefly address the article yesterday, also in the Times newspaper, which reported that Sir Keir Starmer had warned Tory backbenchers they would pay a price for blocking an investigation, including personal attacks for the support of the Prime Minister. I believe it is outrageous that the Leader of the Opposition comes here on a day where we talked about tolerance and rival politics, that this threat of bullying is laid out against members of this House. We all have our own minds, we all may disagree, but to threaten people. I myself have had death threats, and I know many other colleagues have had death threats, but to try and stoke this, I find incredibly dangerous. On bullying, I'll happily give way, of course.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There was no threats of bullying made. What we are talking about is an electoral threat, and I have had to take to the police 2 different death threats, which directly quoted words said in this place by the Prime Minister of our country. Both of them have had to go to the police, including people who have attacked my office on the basis of the words of our Prime Minister. And when it was raised with him, he said, humbug.
That's true.
We must be honest that on all sides of the House there is a death threat, and no death threats. No, this is the important point. No one should be abused of their job. But my point is only yesterday, a day we talked about debates, that, and I quote the newspaper article again, they will pay a price for blocking, pay a price for personalised attack. Personalised attack. And I feel sorry for the death threats. You should not have to receive this. But this is using this. Oh, of course I will give way.
Honourable friend for giving way. Is the point not that we all face abuse from being in this place, and those targeted attacks? As one of the youngest members in this chamber, I fear every day for the bullying and harassment that I receive, and those targeted attacks, all they do is stoke the flames and receive more for all of us.
And indeed they do, but we all should rise above that and treat each other with the courtesy that everyone needs to be in a place of work. Because we have sadly witnesses the violence that his colleagues have been exposed to, and ultimately the deaths of 2 colleagues in this House. Now, going forward, it is clear the Prime Minister has taken significant measures to improve the way things are working in Number 10, and I believe, and I know there are more changes to come. We've talked about Christian forgiveness. I'm a Christian myself, I'm a Catholic, and this is a Christian country, and forgiveness is at the core of what we believe and what this country believes. The Prime Minister has offered his heartfelt apology. He has offered contrition. He has come to the House. He's happy for this to go towards the standard. He's not opposing it. He has apologised. We need to look at that. So now it is time to crack on with the priorities for our country. We have an obligation to deliver on our election promises, and I'm looking forward to this government focusing on important issues for my constituents in Rother Valley, including getting the Rwanda illegal immigration scheme up and running as soon as possible, and winning the war against a fascist Putin, because the Rwanda scheme saves lives. Defending Putin saves lives, and this government, through COVID, has saved many lives in this country.
Chris Matheson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's been a lot of talk today about apologies. Can I just remind the House, first of all, that this is not a question about whether the Prime Minister has apologised or not. It's about whether he knowingly lied to the House or not. And he hasn't apologised for that. He hasn't even admitted it.
Yeah.
In fact, he said there was no party, there was no cake. There was a party, but there was no cake, and I can go on. Persistently and consistently, I welcome those apologies, but let's be clear what the motion in front of the House today is.
Yeah.
I heard earlier today from the leader of the SNP, the Right Honourable Gentleman, who reflected words that our own leader, the Right Honourable Member, my friend from Holborn and St Pancras, has said earlier about the modus operandi of the Prime Minister, which that he leaves a trail of chaos in his wake and lets other people pick up the problems that and to take responsibility for the problems that he has caused. And I have to say to the House that the latest victim of that, and I mentioned it to him earlier, is Mr Speaker himself and the office of the Chair. Because when he has to chuck out the Right Honourable Member for the leader of the SNP, as he did recently, for calling the Prime Minister a liar, he gets huge amounts of public opprobrium saying, what on earth is Speaker Hoyle doing? Why is he chucking the Right Honourable Gentleman? Why is he chucking the leader of the SNP out when we know what the game the Prime Minister is up to? But the Prime Minister doesn't mind because somebody else is taking the criticism for that. I have to say to the House that it is not simply the Speaker who he's undermining. It is this House, as members have said before, it is our democratic system, and the public cannot understand, they simply cannot understand what on earth is going on where one person can get thrown out, but the person that is the root of the problem is happy to stay there smirking on the front bench. That is his modus operandi, and it is dragging our democratic system down. Now, we all make mistakes. I make mistakes. I've had to correct the record myself before now. And we've heard about apologies, and we've heard about
the Prime Minister should be contrite, but I don't recall one occasion when he has come back and corrected the record. Not one. I think there's an outstanding letter to him about the national misleading claim on the National Statistics Office, which he hasn't yet come back to complain about, to correct.
It is true on crime. You said it was falling.
And the bottom line is that the Prime Minister will say whatever he needs to say at that point to get out of whatever situation he is in, with no sense of obligation to the truth, and no sense of obligation to whatever promise he has just made. And actually, I scribbled down a list before earlier on of just about 5 or 10 occasions where he has made promises that he's broken. But I don't want you, Madam Deputy Speaker, to pull me up, because, of course, today we are specifically talking about the occasions when he denied the party. So that list will have to wait for another occasion. But there will be another occasion. And as I mentioned earlier, he is damaging the UK's reputation abroad, because outside of this chamber, our partners abroad and our adversaries and our enemies can see that he is losing credibility, and that he is not somebody that we can necessarily work with, because his word cannot be trusted. That damages the UK, and it is at a time of international crisis, it is very serious. I want to finish by quoting an article that I read in an article in The Guardian by Mr. Simon Cooper earlier, which was about the Oxford Union. And he talked about the Prime Minister, a younger version, writing an essay on Oxford politics for his sister's book, The Oxford Myth. His essay tackles, I'm quoting now, his essay tackles the great question, how to set about becoming the next Prime Minister. Johnson advises politicians to assemble, quotes, a disciplined and deluded collection of stooges to get out the vote. Remember, this was at the time when he was just after he left university. The tragedy of the stooge, the quote from the Prime Minister in his earlier days, the tragedy of the stooge is that he wants so much to believe that his relationship with the candidate is special that he shuts out the truth. The terrible art of the candidate is to coddle the self-deception of the stooge. It was Prime Minister's views then. It is apparently still the Prime Minister's views today. The British people have made their mind up, and for them the penny has dropped. I say to honourable members opposite, it is time for the penny to drop as well. Search your feelings. You know it to be true.
No, I don't.
No, I say to them, Madam Deputy Speaker, that they need to search their feelings. They know it to be true. This is the manner of the Prime Minister, and today is the time to finally put a line underneath that.
Peter Aldous.
I'd like to make 3 brief observations. Firstly, Mr. Speaker was quite right to decide that there was an arguable case to be examined by the Committee of Privileges. That is the issue in front of us today, not whether the Prime Minister intentionally misled the House. That is for the committee to decide. Whilst in many respects this situation is completely